Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in the 65th session of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. If you might remember last year, just a few months before, after the eruption of the COVID pandemic, we had the honor to host Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who talked about the SDGs in the COVID times. In his talk, Professor Sachs emphasized the importance of suppressing the pandemic in order to achieve any sustainable development at all. Today, we are to continue the discussion, and we are so delighted and honored to host an exceptional guest who's joining the call from Paris, Guillaume Lafortune. Hello, Guillaume. Thank you so much for making the time and accepting to contribute this session. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kariman. A pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation today. So, yeah.
If I might introduce you before we start sharing the presentation. Yeah. Guillaume is the director of the Sustainable Development Solution Network. He joined the network in 2017 to coordinate the production of the Sustainable Development Report and other projects on SDG data and statistics. Previously, Guillaume served as an economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and in the government of Quebec, Canada. Guillaume will lead today's discussion around SDGs progress and building forward better. And after he walks us through his presentation, we would love to engage you in a discussion. So please make sure to use the chat box to post your questions and comments. And if you would like to address your questions directly to Guillaume, also please raise your virtual hand. We would love this session to be as interactive as it could be. Guillaume, thank you again for being here with us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Kariman, and good morning to everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So let me thank again the Gerhard Center for the invitation today. So maybe to make a link with the previous webinar that you've had as part of this series with Professor Sachs, I think the point still holds that obviously, the top priority in order to achieve sustainable development is obviously to eradicate this pandemic. And so I'll say a couple of words about some of the work that we do on COVID-19 specifically, but also, and what I'm gonna spend a bit of time doing today is to walk you through some of the results of a report, the flagship report that we recently launched on 14 June 2021. It's called the Sustainable Development Report, which basically tracks every year the performance of all the UN member states on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted by all UN member states in 2015. And so via this report, we have shown some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had, but also made a plea for using the SDGs in order to build forward better. And I think this is the topic of today's conversation. So I will be sharing a few slides. I was asked to speak for about 30 minutes, and then there will be question and answers. So I'll try to stick to this. So you should be able to see my screen now. Very good. And so, as I said, I'll focus on the results of this report that we launched a couple of weeks ago. The report was called The Decade of Action for the SDGs. So as you can see, it's very much looking forward to how can we use this crisis as a way to accelerate progress on sustainable development everywhere. And so, just maybe a quick word about this agenda. So as you all know, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015 by all UN member states, and they cover the various sets of economic, social, environmental, and governance issues that really matter for achieving sustainable development. And so the way we see it is that both the SDGs, but also the Paris Climate Agreement form a package, with the SDGs being targeted to 2030 and the Paris Climate Agreement to 2050. And so I'm the director of the Paris office of the SDSN. Professor Sachs is our president, of course, and SDSN was set up in 2012 by and mandated by the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, to mobilize research and science around the next set of goals, right? So from 2000 to 2015, we had the Millennium Development Goals, and already in 2012, there was this reflection about, how do we move forward after the MDGs? And this is when the idea of having sustainable development goals came up. And so originally, SDSN was involved in informing what would be this next agenda. And then eventually, once the agenda was adopted by all UN member states, we moved into supporting the implementation of this agenda globally and monitoring its implementation. So we have three main streams of work, I would say. One is that we do SDG policy analysis and support. We're also a global network of knowledge institutions with more than 1,200 partners. Then we also do trainings. We have an SDG Academy platform. So for today, I'm going to be speaking about the findings of our latest report, the 2021 SDR. I'll focus on four main aspects. First, the global results of the SDR, which really shows that COVID-19 has been a setback for sustainable development everywhere. I'll also speak a little bit about the recovery and issues around fiscal space, especially in low income and developing countries. I'll share a few words about the results for Egypt specifically. And then I'll say a couple of words about the COVID-19 Commission of the Lancet, on which we are working on, and where the topic of building forward better is, of course, an important aspect of the work. So in terms of this year's edition of the SDR, there were 5 major findings. And I'll start with this, and then the rest will be a lot of charts and visuals to support those key findings. But first one is that for the first time since we adopted this agenda in 2015, the SDG Index, which is the main measurement that we have to track annually how the world is doing on the SDGs, has declined in 2020. And I'll show a key chart in a second. The point here is to say that, the SDGs remain a valuable framework for building forward better. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has not resolved at all issues around eradicating extreme poverty or addressing the climate or biodiversity. So this agenda remains obviously very relevant and important and can be used as a guidepost for the recovery. The second point is that developing countries need increased fiscal space to finance both the emergency measures, but also this investment-led recovery, right? So there's a wide gap in access to financing between high-income countries that are able to finance additional fiscal outlays through debt and access to international markets versus other countries that do not have the same level of access to international markets and that have to tighten their belt and slash sometimes into investment spending to finance the additional health or other spendings required due to the pandemic. And so the report tries to identify some financing mechanism to make sure that we don't end up with really different trajectories in terms of recovery, with high-income countries recovering much, much faster and the rest of the world lagging behind. The third finding is that Finland tops the index this year, yet, and that's one of the key points that we make in this report, is that Finland, but also all the OECD or high-income countries still face major SDG challenges as well. I'll say a word about this. I'll also say a word about some of the challenges that we see for Egypt specifically. We also do see a gap between government commitments and their actual actions, which should be addressed to achieve major SDG transformations by 2030 and beyond. So The index that we do is complemented with assessments of policies, government commitments, efforts for the SDGs. And here we do see sometimes a gap between official statements and the actions, the subsidies, the laws, the regulations that are sometimes in place or are being put in place. And then finally, the decade of action for the SDGs requires a strong multilateral system. We will need to learn the lessons from the crisis, and this is, a lot of the focus of this Lancet COVID-19 Commission that we're working on, and negative international spillovers such as unsustainable trade, but also things like profit shifting undermine countries' ability to achieve the SDGs and must be addressed. So I think we had quite a good news last week on the harmonization of corporate tax rates with the G20 outcome and decision to move forward on this. So those were some of the key findings of the report. And now, these were, the slides with the most text in my intervention today. I'll be now showing a lot of graphics and charts that basically support those various findings. The first one, which you can see very clearly here, is that COVID-19 is a setback for sustainable development on average globally. So what we do, just to say a quick word about the methodology, and I want to focus on the message, not too much on the methods, but our method has been peer-reviewed statistically by Nature Geoscience, by Cambridge University Press. It's been audited also statistically by the European Commission. And what we do is, using about 100 indicators, we normalize them from 0 to 100, where 100 denotes the best performance possible. And then we aggregate this at the goal level to create assessment of countries' performance at the goal level. And then eventually we aggregate the 17 goals into one single SDG index. And so that gives us results for all countries, but it also allows us to do an average for the world. And so when using those around 100 indicators, and those 100 indicators come from, I would say 2/3 come from UN custodian agencies, about 1/3 come from less traditional statistics from our networks of academic and universities, but also from NGOs and research centers as well. And so when we do this and we calculate the SDG index, we see that since the SDGs were adopted, we were seeing some progress happening on the goals, right? So we could always argue that this was not going fast enough. There was also variations, obviously, across countries, and some goals were moving, much faster than others. Some goals were actually going backwards, but on average, overall, we were seeing some progress happening since 2015. Now, as you can see here, 2020 marks a reversal in SDG progress, and really, this is driven by two indicators for which we have data in 2020, which are the increase in poverty rates and unemployment rates. I will show those numbers in a second, but just to say that the decline that we see here in 2020 is likely underestimated because we're still waiting at the global level for a lot of the data to come in for 2020. So we only have some of the data available now for 2020. So as I mentioned, the drop in the SDG index is driven by two key indicators. Really, on the left side, you have here the percentage of people living in extreme poverty. This is less than $1.90 a day, where you can see that in many world regions, this has increased quite sharply in 2020. So this is highlighted with this darker gray zone in the chart. And the issue is that it has increased markedly in places where the poverty rate was already quite high, including in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. The second indicator which drives the drop in SDG index is the rise in unemployment rate. So you can see here that for all the world major regions, whether it's East and South Asia, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, OECD countries, there's been an increase in the unemployment rate in 2020, which is obviously covered under SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. Obviously, the SDGs have had other impacts. This pandemic has had impacts on other SDGs. We have a whole section where we review for key SDG goals what has been some of the impacts. So on the left side here, you see some calculations that we've done using UNESCO data on the percentage of countries with schools that were closed during COVID-19. So you see here that over the period from March to basically June, July, there were countries in many world regions where schools were closed, with obviously lasting impacts on education and learning, which is covered under SDG 4 in the SDGs. And then a quick point on, I would actually say that it covers SDG 12 to 15, which are related to responsible consumption, production, climate action, biodiversity, because you could think that, oh, well, yeah, well, the lockdowns and the drop in economic activity probably has some positive impacts on the goals. Well, to some extent, yeah, but what we see is that those gains have been rather temporary, right? So what you have here on the right-hand side, which is covered under SDG 13 climate action, is the daily CO2 emissions for China and the United States. And you do see a sharp drop when those countries went into lockdown. So you see it for China in January, February, you see the line dropping. You see also in the US a little bit later when economic activity started to contract. But you also do see later on during the year that actually the levels of emissions actually restarted picking up, right? And actually, to some extent, exceeded pre-pandemic levels, as you can see here for China. And so the question is, those temporary gains might not suggest that there are structural changes that have happened throughout this crisis, and we still need to accelerate long-term progress on climate action for the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. And so one major issue that as we see as we're thinking about building forward a better and the recovery is this inequality between high-income countries that have been able to access additional financing versus poorer countries that did not have as much access to financing, both for emergency measures and for the recovery. So what you can see here on the left-hand side, and these are all data from the IMF, but you see here that all the regions, so advanced economies, emerging economies, and low-income developing countries have had a drop in revenues for 2020. Now, advanced economies have increased primary general government primary expenditure, which has been financed through those massive recovery packages in the US that we have seen for the US, for the EU as well. When it has less been the case in low-income countries, for instance, where you see that actually there's been a decline in general government primary expenditure, but also in public investment. Right, and so there's really a gap in fiscal space and the ability to finance additional fiscal outlays between rich countries and poorer countries. And so what this suggests is that the pace of the recovery might be very, very different between, for instance, the United States and other regions, which you have on the right side here, in terms of getting back to pre-pandemic GDP, with some countries, including the US or the EU, getting back to pre-pandemic GDP in 2021 or even early 2022, and other regions taking much longer. And these are averages, but obviously within those averages, there's countries that are expected to get back to pre-pandemic GDP by 2024, 2025, for instance. And SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals, really calls to address those inequalities across countries. And so here, basically, we would see a drop in the global performance on SDG 17 with really paces of recovery that would be different. And so what for us this calls for is to revamp the international financing system and make sure that there's mechanisms that are put in place to increase fiscal space in developing countries. As I mentioned, this is explicitly recognized in SDG 17 that we need to mobilize public financing for developing countries. And the 2021 SDR underlines 4 mechanisms. There might be others, but one of them is obviously improved global monetary management. And here, obviously, the role of the IMF is absolutely crucial in driving this. And the allocation of special drawing rights is obviously one of the key tools for this. In order to help improve liquidity for low-income countries. The second point is on improved tax collection, supported by several global tax reforms. And I think here the point on combating tax havens, financial secrecy, profit shifting is obviously very important. And that's a good news for the G20 meeting last week was obviously a good news. One thing I should mention is that when we look at our top performers on the SDG Index, I mentioned Finland and Nordic countries. These are countries that collect government revenue of around 50% of their GDP, right? So this is quite significant. Then the third point is on the increased financial intermediation by multilateral development banks. So that I think is one of the key thing we're advocating for, is for a key role of multilateral development banks to support long-term development financing. They can borrow on highly favorable market terms. They're also equipped to handle complex lending for infrastructure projects. So we really see a role for the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, and so on, to really support the long-term development financing moving forward. And then, as emphasized by SDG 17.4, find ways to achieve debt relief also for those countries that really need it. On building forward better, and that's a framework that we've been using since 2019. We really think that the SDGs are first and foremost a public investment program in three key aspects: core infrastructure, roads, power, digital, water and sanitation, but also human capital, health and education, and the environment. And so we've published in Nature in 2019 a 6 transformations framework, which we believe can be used to guide some of the investments in recovery plans and packages that aim to be aligned with the SDGs. So this 6 transformations framework tried to reduce a little bit the complexity of working with 17 goals, tried to take into consideration the way governments are organized and which ministries should be cooperating together, and focuses on 6 transformation. One on education, gender, and inequality. The second one on health, well-being, and demography, energy decarbonization, and sustainable industry, sustainable food, land, water, and oceans, sustainable cities and communities, and the digital revolution for sustainable development. They are underpinned by 2 key principles: leave no one behind, and circularity and decoupling. So in terms of the ranking this year, as mentioned, we have Finland that tops the index this year, followed by Sweden and Denmark, 3 Nordic countries. But you can see here that even those countries are not at 100, so there's still some road to go. And I think one point that is interesting, I mean, here you see that there's a lot of European countries that are included here, which might suggest that the European model of a social democracy might be well fitted to achieving sustainable development. But then what's interesting also, and SDSN publishes the Sustainable Development Report, it also publishes every year the World Happiness Report. And when we look actually at the ranking on sustainable development and we compare to the ranking on happiness, which is basically based on a question from the Gallup World Poll on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy are you? We see that there's quite a good overlap in both rankings. Actually, Finland tops both ranking. And so here, what this suggests is that there might be a connection between being sustainable and being happy. A quick word, since the report was published basically 6 years after the adoption of this agenda. When we look at the regions that progress most and the goals that progress most, we see that East and South Asia is the region that progressed most since the adoption of the goal. For Middle East and North Africa, we do see also some progress, and the region is slightly above the world average, which is denoted with dots in the left on the left-hand side. At the bottom, obviously, are some of the countries in Oceania, but also sub-Saharan Africa that perform really well below the world average. And then OECD countries have limited progress, but perform much higher than the world average. In terms of the goals, so we do see some progress, especially on SDG 9 since the adoption of the goal. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure in terms of access to internet, mobiles, and so on. There was also improvement in eradicating extreme poverty, even though the COVID-19 pandemic has also reversed some of those progress, but before the pandemic, there was progress happening. And then also on gender equality, where there was some progress happening compared with the baseline of 2015. By contrast, progress on SDG 12 to 15 was really too slow, and in fact was going backwards for the goals on biodiversity and responsible consumption and production. I mentioned that high-income countries perform at the top, and especially European countries, but even those countries face significant challenges in achieving the SDGs. So you can see here that on average, they haven't achieved most of the SDGs. They're red on average on 12 to 15 related to responsible consumption, production, climate, and biodiversity. One important issue that we highlight is that those countries also outsource impacts abroad, notably through trade and consumption, but also through unfair tax competition and tax havens. And that's the chart that you have at the bottom here, where we produce an international spillover index where we look specifically at those issues. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is an important aspect that we want to cover, and that is covered in the report, is not only the domestic performance of countries, but it's also how much do they undermine other countries' ability to achieve the goals through international supply chains or international financing flows. And so we have done a lot of conceptual work on this, connecting the various elements of spillovers to the SDGs. And so, as mentioned, you have rich countries that perform best on the SDG index, mainly because SDG 1 to 10 are socioeconomic goals, 16 also on institutions, which correlate quite well with GDP per capita. But on the other hand, when you look at which countries outsource impacts abroad the most, you see that OECD countries and high-income countries perform the worst, right? So that's on the right-hand side of the chart, where a score of 0 means low performance, a score of 100 means best performance, and so through consumption and trade, rich countries do generate negative impacts abroad. We track, for instance, countries that outsource cement and steel to another country and then re-import the production. We attribute some of the emissions generated abroad to the importing countries, and the same for things like biodiversity threats, water scarcity, but also things like accidents at work generated by outsourcing key sectors to countries with relatively poor labor conditions and labor standards. So just to mention that besides the country level data that we put, we also do a lot of work on making globalization and trade work for people and planet in the face of the pandemic. Obviously, we're not calling for de-globalization. Trade is obviously a great source of income and employment for many, many countries, and the SDGs emphasize the role of trade, but we do need to address this issue of cleaning international supply chains and aligning them to the SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement. Connecting it to the pandemic, I think science is more and more clear on the links between biodiversity threats, deforestation, and the risk that we will face future pandemic and new pathogens in the future. So this crisis can also be a call for cleaning international supply chains. On Egypt specifically, so this is the country profile of Egypt. As you can see, so on the top left side, Egypt ranks 82 out of 165 countries. Egypt's overall country score is of 68.6, which is slightly above the average for Middle East and North Africa. But we do see that major challenges remain across basically the 4 dimensions of the SDGs: economic, social, environmental, and governance. Just not to take goal 1, for instance, we see that the poverty rates, for instance, with people living with $3.20 a day is still high in Egypt and has increased compared with the baseline of 2015. On SDG 2, stunting, wasting is still very much prevalent in Egypt. On SDG 4, access to primary education is quite well guaranteed and universal. Still challenges with completion of lower secondary, but also with the literacy rate. SDG 5, participation of women in labor force and in parliament remains low from an international perspective. And then on SDG 10, for instance, high income inequalities and other challenges on the environmental and governance goals as well. So happy to say a few more words on this, but we have very detailed country profiles available online where you can see the results for each individual indicators. And for the dashboards and so on. I will conclude soon. I'm aware that I'm close to the half an hour that was given to me, just to say that besides the work that we do on measuring SDG performance, we also look at government efforts, more qualitative type of data, to look at policy efforts and investments, regulations, laws, subsidies, and so on. So we have scorecards that we published this year where you can see, for instance, the discrepancy at times between a commitment, an international commitment, and then what's included within, for instance, the nationally determined contribution on SDG 13 or for climate action, and in terms of unconditional fossil fuel subsidies that can be provided, for instance, in G20 countries. So we're trying also to capture those gaps between commitment and action. We do every year a survey of government efforts for the SDGs, where we also have the same type of finding. Lots of high-level statements in support of the SDGs, but then less than half of the countries mention SDGs in their national budget or in their national recovery plans for COVID-19. The report also serves as a tool to inform the data agenda and statistical capacity. So again, I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that, you know, obviously progress on the SDGs depend on the quality of information that we get to inform the strategies and actions. And here we do see major data gaps still, especially on SDG 4, 5, 12, 13, and 14. On the left side here, you have a chart which shows for the official SDG indicators, the percentage of data coverage, so the percentage of countries with data for each goals, and then the average year of reference, because at times one of the issues is the time lag in reporting, and you can see at the international level that there's still major issues with certain goals. All of this is accessible online. We do this global assessment. We also have regional and subnational editions. We have a training course on sustainable development as well through the SDG Academy. And my last slide is on the work of the Lancet Commission of COVID-19, which is chaired by Professor Sachs. And that's also a connection to what Kariman said at the beginning. And just to circle back on the beginning of our webinar today, that achieving the SDGs depends on our ability to respond effectively to this pandemic. And so here we're working, we've set up a whole commission working with the Lancet, where we cover 4 main themes: recommendations on how to suppress the epidemic, addressing the humanitarian crisis, the financial and economic crisis, and rebuilding an inclusive, fair, and sustainable world. We have thematic task forces, 9 thematic task forces, 3 regional task forces, 28 commissioners, more than 100 experts. We've published comments in the Lancet and also several dedicated pieces. You can see our latest ones here. We made an appeal a few days ago for urgent appeal for 300 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines for Africa, but also on the neurological impacts of COVID-19 and on transforming the recovery into a green future. The final report of this commission will be for the spring of 2022. I will stop here. I think I managed to stay more or less within the time that was allocated to me, and very much looking to the rest of the conversation today. Thank you.
Guillaume, thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. I've read the report, but listening to you talking, I got answers to many questions I had in mind. So thank you for that. Before we move to the audience and get their questions, I just have a couple of questions and comments. to which I would love to hear your thoughts. The first one is related to the private sector's commitment to SDGs. You know, the private sector has a significant potential to contribute to SDGs, and many of them are already using the SDGs language and engaging in reporting and benchmarking, and that's all great. However, observing the behavior of some corporates and the way they look at SDGs vertically could be a little bit alarming. Many corporations, for instance, pick a couple of goals, work aggressively on them, while ignoring and sometimes violating many of the other goals, which I think defies the purpose of the SDGs as a comprehensive framework. So doing no harm should be a no-brainer. And here, I think the reporting process, I believe, is a bit tricky. So if you could talk a bit about the progress in the reporting process when it comes to this issue.
Absolutely, Karaman, and that's a great question. I mean, on the role of the private sector, obviously there's a big role to play for the private sector in this agenda. The private sector remains the largest employer in the economy, of course, and there's also a big role in terms of supporting the financing for this agenda. I mean, we see those green bonds, social bonds as well that are being launched by governments, and so there's obviously a big role for the private sector here. Now, you know, I would emphasize 2 points. First is what I mentioned in my presentation. I do think we need a revamping of international official financing in order to achieve the SDGs. So the private sector alone will not solve all of the issues. We need to accelerate the deployment of financing mechanisms, especially to address the lack of fiscal space in developing countries. I think the news on the IMF additional special drawing rights is a great one, but also on other financing mechanisms to address this issue of fiscal space through the official financing. And the second point is on the private sector itself. So it has a big role to play. Up until now, I think, as you rightly pointed out, Karima, and I think the main challenge is on the level of ambition, right? So as you say, and I think there's been a little bit of improvement, but when this agenda started, what we would see very often is companies identifying a couple of goals. In most cases, it would be SDG 8 on economic growth or SDG 9 on innovation, and then saying, okay, I'm going to prioritize those goals without looking at the agenda as a whole, as an integrated agenda where, you know, the point is not to make a positive impact, let's say on a net basis, but actually to make, you know, positive impacts on all of these SDGs. So that's one limitation, the cherry picking that we would see that we, you know, that still exists, of course, but I think there's been progress here. The second point is on the targets and the monitoring as well. I mean, a lot of ESG reports, you know, and you see the same thing, you know, with governments. I mentioned the gap between commitments and actual actions. You also see it in a lot of ESG reporting as well, where you have great commitments, but then you dig a little bit deeper and there's actually no targets associated with some of the goals that are mentioned, or no indicators associated with achieving those targets. So I think that's also another limitation. And then the third point, which I think is always, you know, important to remember, is that I think there's been a lot of emphasis on very specific initiatives and communications of what the private sector is doing. Now, you know, at the end of the day, putting a beehive on the rooftop of, you know, a company building is not going to solve the issue. So I think it's really about, you know, the level of ambition that is needed to achieve those goals. And I think here in SDSN, to mention the work that we're doing a lot of work, especially on the sector of food and land, to come up with a framework of what does it mean for a business to report adequately in the SDG context. And in a nutshell, we identify 4 main points that really matter, both for the companies themselves, but also for the corporate benchmarks, which are then used a lot for the impact by the impact investing community. And those 4 aspects are: is the product good or bad for the SDGs, right? That's the first thing, because, initially when we started working on this, you could see, a very, fossil fuel company ranking quite well on a ranking because it has internal policies on energy efficiency or on gender equality and so on, but without taking into account the actual product, the end product that is generated. So that should be also considered within the corporate benchmarks, of course, so the product itself. The second point is the internal strategies, the policies, energy efficiency, inclusiveness, and so on. The third point is the supply chains. Right. So does the monitoring and the targets also include impacts that could be outsourced throughout the supply chains, throughout intermediaries and so on, which is something I mentioned throughout my presentation, but I think this is very important. And here, the move that we see, for instance, in Europe on the due diligence regulation and so on, I think is a positive development, where there's more and more this transition towards mandatory requirements for businesses to report on the comprehensive set of impact, not only for their main company, but also throughout the entire supply chains. And the fourth point is the company a good corporate citizen? Does it pay its taxes where it needs to pay them? So, a company will not be aligned with the SDGs if it continues to do tax evasion or not pay its taxes where it needs to pay them, which I think is always a good point to remember, because obviously this undermines countries' ability to leverage needed resources to achieve the goals. So big role for the private sector, of course, but still some issues with the level of ambition that is needed. And the point I started with is obviously a lot of this needs to be driven actually by governments themselves to drive through regulations, laws, rules, investments, official financing, those changes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Guillaume. Another question, and then we will move to the audience. It's about the digital divide. The COVID pandemic accelerated digital transformation, and as per the report, the lowest performers are countries from the global south, and more specifically from Africa sub-Saharan. So are there enough or sufficient effort to help these countries who are already disadvantaged in terms of the digital divide, even before the COVID, to catch up or to manage this threat, if I would call it that?
Yeah, no, the digital is absolutely key. And I think the COVID has been an accelerator of certain trends that were already ongoing, happening before the pandemic, but that just got completely emphasized throughout the pandemic. So, I think this is one of our key transformations in the framework that I presented, which is harnessing the digital revolution for sustainable development. And what we're calling for in SDSN is for massive investment to achieve an SDG goal, which is universal access to digital infrastructure. So that's something that we emphasize a lot. I think this is obviously key for economic growth, but I think what the crisis has also underlined, and as we might face also future crisis in the future, digital technologies can be a great source of resilience at the end of the day. We've seen that those countries equipped with digital tools and access were able to maintain a little bit of education and schooling. I'm not saying this is equivalent to having kids going to the classroom, but still better than nothing. And the same for healthcare as well, right? Digital technologies can really support greater access to healthcare, covered under SDG 3, obviously. So I think you're absolutely right that the COVID-19 crisis should lead to a sharp acceleration and increase of investments to achieve the SDG goal of universal access to internet and digital infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Guillaume. We can now take questions from the audience, and we prefer if you address the question directly to Guillaume. So Ali Rashid, you have a couple of interesting questions. If you'd like to address them to Guillaume.
Thank you so much, Kariman. Thanks so much, Goran, for the excellent presentation. Actually, my question regarding the ranking of the countries, especially the not the developed or the highly income countries, but maybe the emerging countries or the developing countries. For example, as you can, I sent here for Kariman that Kyrgyzstan, for example, or Kyrgyz Republic, it's actually located at the 44th place by SDG Index for the last one. Last year it was ranked 52, but the HDI actually ranks 120. So that how can you see the correlation between SDG Index and the HDI rank, and how you can justify this actually discrepancy or conflict of the positions for the same country across both indices? Thank you so much.
Kariman, should we take a few questions and then I'll answer them, or?
Okay, if you prefer, we can do that. Okay, perfect.
Sure.
Dr. Ali Aouni?
Yeah, hi. Okay, I have two questions. The first one is about the impact of COVID-19. There is an SDG number 3, which has to do with good health and well-being. When you look at it, it addresses specifically, for example, things like TB, HIV, malaria, non-communicable diseases, hepatitis C. It talks about immunization, and it talks about universal health coverage. Now, my question with the onset of the pandemic, which changes completely priorities, and it might impact also the targets. I mean, people say nowadays that there will be increase in malaria cases, for example, 100% increase of malaria cases because of the COVID-19. Does it make sense to specifically have targets that address COVID-19 under the SDG 3 or not? This is the first question. The second one is about, when you look at the SDGs at large, one of the interesting measures of SDG is something called a gap frame, which is from University of Lausanne. Now, those guys have appended a little bit under the governance and under social integration. Governance is very critical. It's only covered in SDG number 16. And it is very incomplete. I give you an example of what they've added. They've added business integrity, public finance. Public finance is very critical in combating COVID, and transparency. The other thing they've added is social integration, which is, again, it's very interesting when you talk about polarization that's happening, even aggravated with the COVID-19. When you talk about governance, you could argue, for example, that you can see what happened in the US, Trump and then Biden, vis-a-vis the vaccination. The whole drama in Brazil is because of the president, Bolsonaro. So political will is actually, you could argue, it's related to governance. Yet, governance is not very well represented in the SDGs. So I want to sort of get your comments about that. Thank you.
Should we take one more question? And Vinat Sharma?
Yes, Yes, my basic question is regarding, the post-COVID situation, because the way we are seeing the companies are very much, countries are very much focused on post-economic growth, high economic growth, which is leading to a trade-off with sustainability. So we are seeing in a situation where we are seeing, a trade-off between, what you call, the education, health infrastructure, and what you call housing, and the basic inequality, the inequalities are rising, because of which, because the countries are too much focused on getting the what you consumption growing through low interest rates and fiscal policies, and that is why we are seeing the so much of high oil prices at this point of time, because high oil prices are going to lead to what you call a lot of fossil fuel cars and a lot more of what you call industrial fuel, as compared to there will be a trade-off with the as compared to with the electrification and a lot more sustainable technologies. Same is the case with the China. We are seeing at this point of time they are over regulating tech with the this listing IPO of Didi Chuxing. So what we are seeing is a lot more what you call over regulation protectionism. So on the one hand, the countries are a lot more there's nationalism sentiment at this point, at some point of time, and on the other level we are seeing that the basic necessities are being compromised, basic for example the the education, health, etc. So don't you feel that the inequalities are going to rise in future because of this, and how can we deal with such type of a scenario, because a lot more the billionaires are going to rise, and at the same time there will be a lot more sustainable development goals are going to be compromised in the future. So your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Great. Well, these are all excellent question. I'll try to take them in order. So starting for the first one on the gap between the Human Development Index. I think this is what the question was about, the HDI and the SDG Index. Well, here I think that the HDI focuses on a much more reduced set of indicators. I think there's one on education, health. I believe they have added also something on climate for the first time last year. But the SDGs are much more, let's say, comprehensive in terms of their coverage. And what we try to do in the SDG Index is to cover each single dimension included in those 17 SDGs, which include things related to governance, for instance, right? So I believe in the HDI, you do not have indicators around security, for instance. You also have, many goals which are related to biodiversity, for instance, under SDG 14 on life below water, and SDG 15 on life on land, for instance, and then 17 on multilateralism and partnerships for the goals. So I think, the framework for both indices are quite different. The number of indicators included for each indices are also different. The methods for compiling the indices are also different. So that could explain on a case-by-case basis some discrepancy. Now, having said that, and I don't have this in mind. I know we have looked at the links between the SDG Index and the World Happiness Report. I haven't done actually the correlation between the HDI and the SDG Index. So you mentioned for one specific country a gap, but I would imagine overall a positive correlation, maybe not full collinearity, but at least some correlation on average between the HDI and the SDG Index. I would assume that a lot of the measures, including in the HDI, are actually good predictors for overall good performance of the SDG Index. But to be verified, I don't have the exact number of correlations, but that's a good idea, actually, of something we could do. The two questions for Ali, really great questions, also on COVID-19 and SDG 3. So I'll make 3 points on this. The first one is that, and that surprised us a little bit in July last year when we were a couple of months into the pandemic, to see so much criticisms against the SDG agenda, during the last July HLPF, with, some articles that were published saying, we need now to scale back ambitions. The SDGs did not allow us to prevent this crisis. They did not cover the issue of pandemic, and even some calling for the international or the multilateral system to actually go back to the negotiation table, bringing all the leaders and coming up with a new sets of goals, even though, already at the time, I think multilateralism was particularly fragmented. And for us, this was a risky proposal because, we could end up with having no goals at all, right? And I think we have to remind ourselves that it's the first time in human history that we have a common set of goals for the entire world, which is a huge achievement, which was done in 2015. So I think it's difficult to change the actual content of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. I mean, some of you might have been involved in this process. This was a very long process, lots of negotiations and so on. But I think SDG 3 provides entry points for addressing many of the issues that came up through COVID-19. On COVID-19 itself, SDG 3.D covers the issue of preparing and responding to global health security issues, right? So this was something that was said at the time that the SDGs do not cover this issue. They do cover the issue under SDG 3.D. And that's, an entry point for, first of all, having better measure to track countries' preparedness for this. We did a little bit of work on this where we correlated the pre-pandemic measures of preparedness for pandemics versus COVID-19 outcomes, let's say a couple of months within the pandemic. And, we saw no correlation at all between the level of preparation of a country in theory, using the measures that were available, and the effectiveness of their response after all. In fact, a lot of those indices were topped by the US and the UK, for instance, which did terribly in the first couple of months of this pandemic, which also underlines, the role of political leadership as well. But so I think here, on monitoring, there's an entry point. There's also an entry point for learning the lessons on how to monitor country preparedness and build resilience. And this is a lot of the work that we're doing on the Lancet Commission to see how can we strengthen and improve some of the mechanisms or make recommendation to improve those mechanisms looking forward. And then SDG 3 also calls for universal health coverage, and obviously has targets on malaria and tuberculosis, which are obviously very much relevant. And I think if anything, this crisis revealed the need to accelerate progress towards UHC, towards social protection. I think those countries that were best equipped with UHC and social protection managed much better in the end the pandemic and reduced the health impact and other impacts on their population. So I think we can work with SDG 3 as it is. It does incorporate the right issues, the right targets, the right goals. It's difficult internationally, I believe, to go back to change the text of the actual agreement and the goals, but I think we can work with SDG 3 as it is. The other question, which is an excellent one, obviously, is on political leadership and the role of governance. So, we could argue that governance is not covered enough within the goals. I mean, we do have a goal with SDG 16 on peace and strong institutions. We are doing a lot of work, and that's why we came up with the 6 transformations framework to see how can we operationalize this agenda. What does it mean for a government to take those goals seriously? And I think here in general, we underline 4 main aspects. One is that countries need to think about long-term pathways, right? How do we move from point A to point B on key goals and targets, and those should be informed by science. And if anything, I think this crisis also revealed the key role that science could play to inform policies, but also to bring up some of the solutions. And here I'm thinking about the vaccines, for instance. So key role for planning, long-term planning in collaboration with science in order to generate those pathways. Second one is to set bold targets. Right? Once you set bold targets, then it can generate momentum around those targets, and help also align the investments to those targets. So that applies at the international level, and we hope that with the next COP CBD, we will have ambitious targets on biodiversity, but it also applies at the national level as well. Budget, obviously, financing, aligning those targets, pathways with the national budget, and then social legitimacy, openness, transparency. I think, to speak, I mean, I'm based here in Paris, in France. We know that if you try to move forward on the climate action and, set up a carbon tax without having the social legitimacy, without taking into account some of the negative distributional effects that those might have on people, you can end up with social unrest and the gilets jaunes, which happened before this pandemic. And so the need to have open processes, consultation, and widespread stakeholder engagement is absolutely key for social legitimacy. But also, I think it underlines the relevance of the SDGs as an integrated agenda. You cannot address the climate issues, for instance, through a carbon tax, without addressing the issue on poverty, jobs, economic growth, because the losers will not accept, the reforms that you're doing on the other side. So I think, being here in France, I think this is something that resonates really, really well. The fourth question was, I guess there were two questions in that fourth question. One was on the level of ambition of the recovery plans that we see so far, and the other one was on some of the failures, let's say, related to multilateralism. Let me say a quick words on both. On the recovery side, I mean, I guess we can see the glass half empty, half full. In my response today, I'll give an answer on the half full glass, but I'm very much aware that when we look around, we do see some negative trends, including in terms of subsidies and actions that are being done. But if I look at the EU, for instance, and the 1.8 trillion euro package that was set up through the Next Generation EU program and the multi-annual financial framework, there is the ambition of earmarking a lot of this extra funding to the digital and climate transformations. There's a whole process with the European semester to coordinate across member states. The EU has now a taxonomy for sustainable investments, which other countries are looking at with inspiration. And in the case of the EU, I think the EU was the first continent to set a bold target for achieving net zero by 2050. So I do see some hope in certain parts of the world that the recovery plans and packages will be aligned, at least to some extent, to the achievement of the SDGs. On the failure in multilateralism, I think here also, I mean, there's been a couple of success. I think the sharing of information among scientists has been, fabulous. The process for elaborating the vaccines has also been, it's completely historical. I think central banks also have reacted quickly and decisively through that process. Now, it is true, especially on the distribution of vaccines, that even though the COVAX and other processes that were put in place were good idea, in practice, they haven't generated the results and they were not financed the way they should have been financed. So I think here also, and this is something we're working a lot as part of the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, we will need to learn the lessons and build a stronger multilateral system, because for a lot of the challenge that we're going to face, whether it's a pandemic, climate action, or even things like cyber security, they cannot be tackled and addressed by one single nation. So we do need effective multilateral processes. I think I'll stop here. I think I've answered the 4 questions that were asked. Kariman, maybe over to you.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, for this very insightful discussion. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure the participant did as well. So thanks a million. It was lovely having you. And by this, we are done with the summer round of our webinars. And as we say in Egypt, we close by the best. And we will come back in fall So please make sure to check our social media near the mid of August. We will announce for the September webinar. And yeah, that's all. Thank you so much and have a lovely summer break. Thank you.
Thank you very much.